This is Weights and Wealth, your one-stop shop for entertaining education on building a stronger body and bank account.
We are not doctors or financial advisors and must warn you this is not medical or investing advice. It is for your entertainment.
Welcome back to Weights and Wealth. This is our book club episode focusing on the Myth of Capitalism. Woo, woo. So it's by Jonathan Tepper. Fantastic read. I listened to the audiobook, and Ted read the physical book. So
of course.
It's actually very readable. Just kind of like broad thoughts right now before we kind of dive into it.
Sure.
Very readable, similar to, Thomas Sowell and, like Advanced and Basic Economics. It takes, something that you would think would be very dry reading and like boring and kind of makes it more digestible, more understandable. It's a very readable book, and you never feel like it's just dragging on and on, because a lot of books on the economy, on economic theory and stuff like that are really dry and painful. Like I've gotten about a third of the way through Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley, and that is a painful book. Yeah. There are multiple pages of just tons of raw iron produced by Germany in 1911. Like it's very, very dry, very statistic heavy. This has the same statistics, but they weave it together in a way that makes it very palatable to the average reader.
Yeah, and whenever it's got a term that the average person without an economics background might not know, it goes through and explains it in like one sentence, very clear. Off the top of my head, because I was just flipping through it again before we do this episode, monopsony. A lot of people might not know what that is. People know what a monopoly is, but they might not know monopsony is when there's only one company that has all of the labor, that buys labor, essentially. That's monopsony. So it explains that in one sentence when it brings that into the fold. So you definitely don't need an economics background to read this book. And if you're afraid of how long the book is, oh no, it looks like it's 260 pages. Don't worry. Lots of graphs there that take up large portions
big
of the page.
pictures.
So yeah, we're all about the pictures.
Ted's a big picture book. And there's also significant notes and appendixes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So don't be intimidated by the thickness of it. I mean, to be honest, this is a very average length book.
Yeah.
If you're a regular reader, it's no heavy lifting on that part. Our shout out for this week goes out to John from Killeen, Texas. A good friend of mine. He's given us some feedback before, and I thought he would be interested in this episode. So just kind of pinging him, letting him know we appreciate his support, and we look forward to hearing back on his thoughts on this, because he's a big reader as well, and really strives to have independent thoughts and grow intellectually, physically, in every aspect of his life. So I admire him a lot for that. And I think you would enjoy this episode. So shout out to John. And Ted, you want to take us into the beginning of the book?
Let's get into it. So again, The Myth of Capitalism, Monopolies, and the Death of Competition by Jonathan Tepper and with Denise Hearn. I first heard about this book. I think I'm the one that brought it up for the book club, but I heard about it through Patrick Bet-David. He's always got good reading recommendations, and he talked about it a few different times. So I thought that's interesting. I'll go ahead and read it, and I was pleasantly surprised. It is written from a very neutral political perspective, I found, where it criticizes everyone that has led to our economy and where it is right now, whether that's Reagan or Obama or anyone else going way back earlier into American history, even Teddy Roosevelt, So it's not going to give you like a bias either way. I don't think. I think it's written very neutrally.
It's a very neutral and clear understanding of like what the actual economic landscape is, because your high school AP economics and even your college economics courses are not going to teach you what the real landscape is like out there. The amount of government regulation, the amount of corporate kind of takeover of government agencies, the amount of vertical and horizontal monopolies that exist. The free market is not very free, essentially. This book is explaining in detail. You know, it's like
the main theme here is that we don't have free market capitalism in America. We've had concentration in almost every industry due to a variety of factors: regulation, technology, the misuse or non-use of antitrust laws. So I think we'll just dive right into it. We'll kind of go through some of the high points of the different chapters, not essentially summarizing it, but going into some of the things that we found really interesting or really alarming. And if you haven't read the book yet, even though we always tell you guys in advance, hey, read this book for the book club so that you know what we're talking about as we go through it. But by the end of this, our hope is that you're even more interested in the book and that you go ahead and read yourself too, because we can give you some of the high points, hit the wave tops, go in depth on a couple of things. But I think you'll retain more of the knowledge if you read it. I always find that reading something instead of listening helps me retain more knowledge. Yes,
definitely. And I listened to the book, so I retain pretty well like knowledge that I'm listening to in an audio medium, but reading is 100% going to be the best method for you to actually like digest and retain this information. So I definitely recommend reading it. That way you can annotate it. Like if you look at Ted's stuff, looks like a schizophrenic was reading this, but it's actually not that bad. He has books that are far more marked up than this, but you know, you can see he's using a pen to underline stars, exclamation points, highlights, different colors.
Putting in notes myself.
Yeah.
What I'm thinking while I'm reading it. And random page here. Only necessary because government complexity of tax code. I'm putting in my own thoughts while I'm reading stuff. But.
And I spoke with Ted about this before the episode, but one of my favorite things to do with a book, especially because writing in the margin can be useful, and I do that, but it can be very helpful if you're a person that is comfortable writing in their books, is if you go to the back right here, what you can do is you can simply write down the page number on this and this right here, you know, like the blank back cover, write down the page number of the quote or idea and stuff like that. And that can give you a quick reference point, especially if you're like writing it for like a book report or something like that. That's an easy way for you to literally have the book and then just be like, oh, I need that quote about X. Where is it? And then you just flip to the back and you're like, oh, it's on page 155. And you flip right there and then now you found it. So it's like an easy way to like make a personal, like almost your own table of contents on the back of the book. So that way you're not like scribbling too much in the actual contents of it, and you can do your highlighting and underlining and then actually write out your thoughts. Or you can be like, quote 155, write your thoughts on it. Or like, let's say you're writing it for a paper and you have an argument in mind that you want to make. You can be like, hey, quote on page 176 supports this line of thinking, you know, for my, my research paper or whatever it is.
We'll jump into chapter 1 after we hit some of Nick's notes. This is like a quick and dirty things you'll maybe learn in the book.
Yeah.
It's got breakfast foods there's 3 companies that have 85% of the market: Kellogg, General Mills, and Post. Nestle, Coca-Cola, and PepsiCo, another 3, own 9 out of the top 10 bottled sugary drink brands. Molson Coors and AB InBev control 90% of the beer market, including craft beers. So this is where you're seeing a lot of that consolidation with these oligopolies at the tops of all these industries. Acquisitions increase prices and decrease wages and decrease innovation. That's a big part of the book as well. And the main theme that Nick came out with was avoiding concentration of power is better off for the economy.
Yeah.
All right. Sean, should we start at chapter 1, or do you want to hit the Sherman Antitrust Act first?
Let's start off with chapter 1 so we can kind of tie in the Sherman Antitrust Act where it is a little more relevant to the kind of scheme of the book.
All right. So chapter 1, where Buffett and Silicon Valley billionaires agree. So this is the first chapter of the book, and right away I was shocked by this. I guess I didn't really know that Warren Buffett almost exclusively goes after investing in companies and markets where there's a monopoly at the top.
Yeah, and I mean, it makes sense. Like I remember from the audiobook, like Warren Buffett for a long time was really opposed to investing in airlines because it was such a high competition market, right? Margins are tight. There's a lot of different airlines out there that, are all competing fiercely against each other. Yeah. And recently, within the past 5 years, he has started to go heavy into the airline industry because of the concentration that has occurred there, right? Whether it's the weak competitors, went bankrupt. And so, like the larger companies are taking over their market share, or there were mergers and acquisitions, stuff like that. So now the airline market is concentrated enough. It has moats, as Buffett says, that incentivize or that allow him to be more comfortable allocating his capital into that area because they've kind of become more blue chip, right? And that's kind of an interesting concept. Is that blue chip almost means that it's a monopoly, right? Because it's going to be very steady and generally just go up over time because they have such a dominance in that sector of the economy that there is no real competition. There are no real disruptors. So that one company, that blue chip stock is the company. That's the only one in that sector. So if you want exposure, you have to invest in them, which is just kind of a self-repeating thing. So essentially this chapter argues that we don't have a monopoly problem, we have an oligopoly problem. And you want to explain the difference between a monopoly and an oligopoly?
Yeah, so monopoly is when there's one company that controls a vast majority of the product. Yeah. And then oligopoly is where there's maybe 3 to 5 companies that are controlling the vast majority of the product. So once you get to an oligopoly, it seems like there's maybe some variation in competition, but what happens with oligopolies is that they typically form this kind of cartel and they can all increase their prices together because they just make deals with each other. It's the classic Coke and Pepsi, like featuring each other in each other's ads. They both win no matter what. As long as people keep consuming these sugary drinks, Pepsi and Coke both win. They both go up in value.
Yeah. So and that's kind of like this thing, like price signaling is technically illegal, but there's a lot of different ways to, kind of skirt that regulation. And that's oftentimes what happens with oligopolies. And that's essentially, this results from mergers and acquisitions, aka, like Wall Street, think Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, like a lot of these like private equity and, M&A firms that facilitate the concentration of these industries. So they've been at all-time highs. And antitrust lawsuits, I think the SEC and the Attorney General and all that stuff, that they're responsible for enforcing antitrust regulation, those are at all-time lows.
Yep.
So that combination, you have you end up with an oligopoly.
Yeah.
Or some sort of, like horizontal monopoly.
Yeah. If mergers and acquisitions are at an all-time high and antitrust enforcement is at an all-time low and they're not breaking up these companies that are gaining too much consolidation, then what you wind up with is oligopolies in every industry. Yeah. So that's the first chapter gets into that and kind of goes through some graphs that show mergers and acquisitions over time and antitrust enforcement over time.
And we'll close out this chapter with this Chesterton quote, and we'll come back to Chesterton at the end just because he has this economic theory that I find interesting. I don't advocate for it, but in some ways I think it's an interesting thought exercise to just think through, and I don't think enough people understand it or know what it is. But Chesterton says, capitalism is contradictory as soon as it is complete. For the master is always trying to cut down what his servant demands, and hence is cutting down what his customer can spend. He is asking the same person to act in contradictory ways. He wishes to pay him as a pauper, but wants him to spend like a prince. So that is, kind of summarizes a lot of the problems with the truly laissez-faire capitalistic markets, right? Because if you're trying to increase your profits by cutting wages, well, who is going to buy your product? And obviously, like, not every single company exists in a insulated vacuum, right? We don't expect Lockheed Martin's employees to be buying their products, right? So like that obviously doesn't apply to every industry. But if you just think of that as a broad scale, that kind of does. It's like, oh, okay, well, like, we can't be having, like a depth groveler working class where they literally make no money and then all consumption is concentrated at the top, right? Because that's just not sustainable. So I think that's what Chesterton is essentially arguing.
Yeah, and I was surprised by how many G.K. Chesterton quotes were in this book.
Yes.
Because I tend to think of him more for his like religious thoughts and quotes. I didn't realize just how much of an economic thinker he was as well.
Yeah.
Getting into chapter 2, dividing up the turf. This gets into how oligopolies start to operate as cartels. So there's a lot of really interesting statistics in this chapter where it goes through industry by industry, how these oligopolies, how much of the market they control. I'm just going to read this excerpt from chapter 2. Like mob families, insurance companies completely dominate their own states. According to data from the Kaiser Family Foundation, the median market share of the leading health insurer per state is 54%. There are 17 states in which a single insurer covers more than 65% of the population, and there are at least 24 states in which one insurer covers more than 55%. So this shows kind of how with insurance, there might be a lot of different insurance companies across the United States that have different shares of the market where it doesn't look like a monopoly. But then once you start to break it down state by state, they are monopolies. So they're kind of like a mob cutting up a city and saying like, okay, this family will take the south side, this family will take the east side. These insurance companies are doing the same thing with the states. And when you break it down more like that, it's a lot more alarming than, oh, there's 18 different insurance companies that all have like 6 to 10% of the market. Well, no, state by state, their monopolies are controlling 60+% of the market.
It's very different when you look at it from a more local perspective. And I think a lot of this kind of comes down to federal regulation, like, because there's, I worked in risk management for a little while as an internship, and you have to pass, like, each state has different laws regarding insurance. So if you're you have to pass a new exam every time you want to sell insurance or like be an insurance provider in a lot of
states like that, real estate law.
Yeah. So it's just the amount of regulation kind of squeezes out smaller competitors, right? Because they don't have the economy of scale to be able to like get into each market. They might just be local and they can't offer the same rates because insurance in a way is kind of just a large slush fund that everybody pays into. And therefore you mitigate the risk, right? Because if you have, let's say it's a life insurance one, if the majority of your clients are under the age of 40, and the minority are over the age of 65, well, that's a pretty sustainable business model because you have the amount of people paying in, it's being invested into a large hedge fund essentially that, outpaces inflation. And so when the time for payouts comes, they're lower and lower than the income. So it's a pretty simple business model, but with the amount of regulations and laws that prevent disruption of that, it kind of facilitates these local monopolies occurring in the insurance market in particular.
Yeah, the chapter also goes on to talk about other industries. One of them, it talks about is agriculture and meat. So only 4 corporations provide 57% of all poultry, 65% of all pork, and 79% control of all beef sold in the U.S. And we talked a lot about this in our big beef episode. So go back and check that one out if you're interested in that. But what it gets into even further than that, just the oligopoly control there, is how these companies impact small farmers, and how these small farmers have to take out loans of $1 million+ to build these farms, but then they're just contracted out and controlled by the pricing models of these big companies like Tyson and Purdue. So even though you have these small farms, they're really working for these larger companies, and they don't have any control outside of that. I think with the regenerative farming kind of space exploding, we are seeing a lot more people go through small farms, which is really good.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a change in the market makeup, but it's certainly not a thing that most people can do. Like, I'm buying a half a cow, and it's pricey. You know, it's like $5 a pound. But you know, I know where the meat's coming from. I know its source. I know the guy who raised the cattle. Like, it's very, very high quality, and I know that there's no crap in it, essentially. So, you know, price is what you pay for medicine. So
yeah. All right, chapter 3: What monopolies and King Kong have in common. This one was super interesting to me because it starts with breaking down how animals' size and strength correlate, which I thought was super interesting. So to paraphrase, the size of an object determines its structure, and then as the size increases, the structure must increase more than proportionally. And it talks about the square cube law from like zoology. So if you were shrunk to 1/10 of your height, your muscles would be 1/100th the proportion of strength, and then you would only weigh 1,000th of that. So it's taking the square root and then the cube root of it. And then it goes on to compare new companies to ants. So they innovate, they open new markets, they create growth. People always say how ants are strong enough to lift a piano if they were as big as humans. So the new companies are like ants, and then the bigger companies, if you think of like an elephant and how big its limbs have to be to support it, the large companies employ massive numbers of people, but they have to implement bureaucracy and enforce cohesion at that size. So they wind up spending a lot less of their money on innovation and creating new markets and disrupting the market.
And more maintaining what they have and preventing incursions.
Yeah, and then it gets into sociology and why this is the case. If you've ever heard of the Dunbar number. The Dunbar number is 150, and it goes into like sociology and the number of people that you can kind of keep in your mind, knowing their names, their faces, what's going on in their lives. The number of people that you can kind of remember typically is around 150 people. So when you look at like through human history, as people were forming tribes, once you start to get above a tribe of like 150 people, you need more of like a government structure in place to manage the human relations. And that's exactly what these larger companies have to put in place. They have to put these bureaucratic structures in place to mediate everything.
Exactly, because you can't have personal relationships with 1,000 people.
Yeah, that's why Weights and Wealth doesn't have an HR department. It's Nick, Sean, and I. We don't need an HR department.
Not yet.
But if Weights and Wealth had 500 employees, we would need, I don't know, 8 people in an HR department that were paying a salary just for this bureaucratic, maintaining relationships between people. So
it's the same reason why like labor laws, like there's, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's certain like federal labor laws that do not apply to you if you're below a certain size.
Yeah, a lot. I think it's like 100 employees a lot of times for like small, you're considered a small business. You would know more about the number, but that's kind of relating to that Dunbar number.
Yeah, exactly. Because you can't like actually mediate things. So it's pretty interesting. Moving on to chapter 4.
Oh, I wanted to hit another thing real quick.
Yeah.
So chapter 3 also gets a lot into how bigger companies and consolidation of industries leads to higher wages and less competition. So it goes through a bunch of different industries in here. It goes through hospitals. Prices are 15% higher in markets with one hospital compared to 4 or more hospitals. Cable. American consumers would gain $65 billion a year if they paid the same as Germans do for mobile phone contracts. That's insane.
Wow.
Airlines, fares were 27% higher in concentrated hubs like Atlanta versus non-concentrated hubs. Concrete, beer, it gets into all these different industries and just shows how once you start to see this consolidation, the prices just get out of control.
I mean, it makes sense. I mean, think about it. Like, if you can kind of charge whatever you want, you're going to charge whatever you want.
It makes sense, but it's not what we learn, because in your high school economics class, you learn economies of scale and increased efficiency as businesses grow. But one of the things that this book points out is all these different studies that show that prices actually increase once there's consolidation.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what your high school economics class is. It's lagging, right? Let's think about it as like it's a decade behind, right? Because it has to go through the whole compliance and approval process. So it was written in 2015 and now it's published in 2025. Well, the economy is very different, right? And we see things develop in real time that can't make it through, again, more red tape in time to be taught to people. And sometimes there's an incentive not to teach people this. So having a true understanding of where the economy actually is generally not something that a lot of people in the decision-making positions see as a net positive.
Yeah. Moving on to chapter 4. Chapter 4 is about squeezing the worker. You want to start with chapter 4?
Yeah. So essentially it argues that non-competes, so those agreements between, can be between law firms. That's a big one. If you're a lawyer and you're working at a firm and you're like, I'm done here, I want to start my own. You can't, poach that company's clientele, right? You can't form a relationship with a client that you're working with and be like, hey, I think I can do a better job. You really like me. I really like you. Let's go start our own firm and I'll be your lawyer. Basically it's working against that. And then it's also, I think they talk a lot about big tech. They kind of have the same thing.
A lot of, in the beginning of Silicon Valley, a lot of big tech companies had non-compete clauses in your employee contracts. Yes. There's the famous, I'm not sure if anyone listening has ever seen the email, but Adobe and Apple in the early days had basically a non-compete with each other, but Adobe started poaching employees from Apple, and Steve Jobs sent an email to the CEO of Adobe, and it basically said, it was really short, it was like a 2-sentence email, and it said, it's come to my attention that you've started hiring a couple of our employees. Please let me know if you would like to continue or if we should start employing your employees. It's a really, really funny email. So definitely Google that. Yeah. It's a funny email to look at. It's savage Steve Jobs.
He's a brutal businessman. But that's that kind of what these non-competes do is, it limits worker freedom to, leverage their experience and their productivity against, their employer. And I've talked about this before in another episode, but I had a friend who kind of did this and he applied to another job and they offered him a higher wage or a higher salary and a promotion. And he brought it to his boss. He was like, hey, what can you do about this? And, they matched and gave him a higher bonus and stuff. So a non-compete would not allow that to happen. Right. Yeah. And so go ahead.
The chapter gets into how studies show that these non-compete clauses wind up reducing wages. Exactly as Sean phrased it perfectly. It's decreasing the freedom of the employee.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the hearts of this book is when you decrease freedom, a lot of times prices increase.
Yeah, well, and that's kind of the thing is like a free market. Not only does it apply to the corporation, right? It's freedom to compete in the market, but it also, like, a free market implies the freedom of the employee, right? Like, if you don't have a free market, if your labor is all indentured servants, that's, you have monopoly on labor at that point.
Yeah, and the second half of this chapter gets a lot into how even without non-compete clauses, there's a lot of places where there is only like really one place to work. Yes. A lot of places in rural America where Walmart and Amazon are like your only option for employment outside of like a really, really small business or family farm or something like that. So it gets into not just these actual non-compete clauses, but these more informal non-compete settings. And it also brings up this, it calls it a brain drain across rural America. So I'm just going to read from it. In 1980, if you lived in Washington, D.C., your per capita income was 29% higher than the average American. In 2013, you would be 68% above. In New York City, the income was 80% above the national average in 1980 and skyrocketed to 172% above by 2013. Power and money began concentrating in urban centers across the country and on the coasts as rural brain drains occurred.
And that's kind of interesting because, again, going back to like the high school economics, that's kind of the opposite of what you learn, right? Like we were always taught like money goes where it's cheap to acquire capital, right? In this case, we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing money, power, and jobs concentrated in high cost of living, high cost of input areas, rather than the opposite. And I think a lot of that's due to like just the kind of makeup of the economy, right? Like when you're taught economics 101, they're not really talking about globalization. They're talking about like how does an economy work at like a state and local level, right? They're not factoring in multinational corporations that are offshoring 90% of the inputs to Thailand, and then they, because the input cost of the labor and the parts are actually so cheap, they can afford to pay these lucrative salaries to the minority of Americans that they employ.
It also does highlight some companies in here that have done a good job of increasing employees' wages. So like not every company is out there just maximizing their profits and not increasing their employees' wages. It highlights Costco, which I didn't know that Costco was such a.
It's like one of the highest worker satisfaction places.
Yeah, it said Costco continuously ranks among the world's most beloved companies, not only because of the free samples. They continue to outperform industry competitors, pay workers well, offer great benefits close to 90% of staff, and have very low turnover as a result. Costco workers are paid more than $20 an hour, and as a result have only 5% employee turnover for those who have been with the company for over a year. And that reminded me a lot of Buc-ee's. You see the same thing when you go to Buc-ee's. Have you ever seen on the gas pumps like the employee compensation?
No,
because they're always hiring.
Oh, well,
people.
yeah. So and it's like general manager is like 160.
Yeah, and even like the restroom janitors are like 80 or 90,000. Like it's you can make good money working at Buc-ee's, but I guess people just love to work there. So
you take care of your people, and like they're going to be enthusiastic about working there, and they're going to. It's like an organic referral.
Yeah,
there.
It's like the Chick-fil-A employees. You wind up getting the best employees in the fast food industry because you're getting the most talented service.
Exactly.
I starred this quote. Whenever I come across a really good quote by someone, I highlight and star it so that when I'm flipping through a book, I can easily see the quotes that I liked. So Costco CEO Greg Jelinek puts it this way. I just think people need to make a living wage with health benefits. It also puts more money back into the economy and creates a healthier country. It's really that simple. It'd be nice if every CEO thought that way.
Yeah. And I mean, that goes back to the Chesterton quote, right? It's like if you don't, and particularly for an industry like Costco, like Costco employees probably shop at Costco. So like if you're not paying them well, how do you expect anyone else to afford it if like the people that work at your company of general consumer goods can't afford to consume these general consumer goods?
Yeah, the Chesterton quote, the end of it was essentially you can't pay people like paupers and expect them to spend like princes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It's a very simple and kind of, just like it's a catchy phrase, but in this particular case, it is very, very appropriate. And it kind of contrasts with Walmart, where like the majority of their people are also on food stamps, which is like the opposite. Like think about like your experience at Walmart versus Costco.
Yeah.
Where do you want to go? What is a better place where you can get higher quality goods, higher quality service? It's obviously going to be Costco.
Yeah. It also, at the end of this chapter, gets into regulations, which I thought was very interesting because I've always been, I wouldn't say anti-regulation, but relatively anti-regulation.
Minor, minimize regulation.
Yeah. Regulations just get in the way of people starting their own businesses and provides disadvantages to small businesses and disruptors. So it's brought up that 70 years ago in the 1950s, around 1 in 20 American workers needed an occupational license. Today, it is 1 in 4. And then it gets into some studies that show no clear links between having occupational licenses in industries and improved quality of service from that licensing.
Interesting.
So it's always interesting when, you have an opinion about like an economic theory or something, and then someone's able to show you these studies that prove it.
Yeah.
Because a lot of time when we talk about economics, it's all this theory. But
what is the actual data to back it up?
Yeah.
So like that, this book is a wealth of studies and statistics that are very interesting. Some might even cause you to second think or have second thoughts on a previously held position, but a lot of them can confirm some ideas that you've had. So moving on to chapter 5, if you're good with that.
Yep.
Silicon Valley throws some shade.
So
go ahead.
This one, this chapter goes hard on Google.
Yeah.
Were you surprised a lot by this chapter? I was shocked when I was reading some of it. I just didn't know some of the stuff.
I mean, the fact that they decided to do away with their old motto of "Don't be evil," they're like, yeah, no, that doesn't really apply to us anymore. Like they made that conscious decision. Like think about that.
Yeah. So without even looking at the pages or the outline, one of the things that just is seared into my brain from this chapter is how Yelp was started up and they had reviews of all these restaurants and different companies, and Google started, once they saw how many views Yelp was getting, and there's internal documents that support that they intentionally did this. They started limiting people going to Yelp. They stopped bringing Yelp up high in the search results where it should have been based off the traffic to the site. Their site traffic reduced significantly, like 80, 90%. And it wasn't just Yelp. There's other companies that have popped up that Google's done this too. And then Google just in search took the data from Yelp and put it at the top of search. So it's like when you Google a restaurant reviews or something, and you see the Google reviews at the top, they pull all that data from Yelp, and you see it on Google.
They're scalping Yelp.
But they're scalping Yelp because Yelp doesn't actually get the site visit. They can't make money off advertising and stuff from that. So they take all these online companies, and once the company is growing because they're providing a great service to people, they just destroy the site traffic to that website, pull the data, put it at the top of search under a Google review or something else, or Google Shopping, or Google has all these clusters of different services they provide. And they don't have to do any of the work of creating that new segment or service. They just pull all the data from someone else that did the work to create it, take their idea. It is like a brutal business. I mean, it's a crazy chapter. I mean, when you're in a position of power like that, like I said, like a lot of things come down to what is the content of the character of the individual or the corporation that is in these key positions to influence
multiple segments of the economy. And I mean, a search engine in the internet era is like the place. Like, what do you do? You're researching a trip, or you're looking for best restaurants in the area. You're probably going to go on Google, or on the internet and use a search engine. And and they have the primary dominance of that, and they determine what you see. You know, it's pretty ridiculous. Like,
and it's not just Yelp. Like, it's Getty Images was
a huge thing.
Getty's traffic fell 85% when Google scalped them. Foundum fell 92%. Like, this was a crazy chapter to me. But we suggest you read the book, so we won't go through every single statistic in this chapter. Should we move on to the next chapter?
Yeah. So toll roads and robber barons. Places with highly concentrated industries and plummeting manufacturing jobs find exacerbated income inequality issues. 30% of households in Silicon Valley can't afford basic needs without assistance. Wild to think that, right? You know, this is like the mecca of tech, where billions of dollars are made every year.
History repeats itself. This is like U.S. Steel. That's why it calls the chapter Toll Roads and Robber Barons.
Yeah. I mean, it's like these places where these massive corporations are moving in and buying up everything. Well, if you're just a guy who grew up there, and now a house in your neighborhood costs 5 times what it did when, before that company came, because all these high-powered executives and highly compensated individuals are all moving there. So it's this kind of destruction of the local economy while building the national or global, which is this odd, kind of like I hate to use the word equity, but it's unbalanced in a way where you would think that the people working or living in the area around this wealth generating corporation would also be lifted up, right?
Yeah.
Rising tide should lift all boats, but oftentimes that ship kind of comes in and it just sends a full broadside into the local fishing economy and sinks all the boats.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah, and this chapter also gets into some of those industry concentrations that that Nick wrote down, that we talked about in the beginning, whether that's the sugary drink industry or beer. It gets into some of those different industries and how they're concentrated. And then I liked this quote as well. The average person knows they're being screwed and feels the system is rigged against them. Dozens of industries are so egregiously concentrated that it begs the question as to what the authorities are doing with their time. We don't know. We know for a fact that workers at the Securities and Exchange Commission spent their time watching porn while the economy crashed during the financial crisis. We would hate to speculate about the Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission. So it gets into how these industries are getting super concentrated. These mergers and acquisitions are happening, but the government watchdog organizations that are supposed to be protecting the people against these oligopolies and monopolies are not doing their jobs.
No, they're literally just wasting time, not doing their job, and doing things that probably should get them fired.
Yeah,
especially on company time in a company in a workplace.
Yeah, and it's pervasive across the entire economy. I won't go into all the statistics for the different industries, but I'll read off some of the industries that it talks about having these high monopoly and oligopoly rates. It's got cable and high-speed internet, computer operating systems, social networks, search. Google's got 90% share. Milk, railroads, seeds. It gets into GMO and seeds. Microprocessors, funeral homes. The funeral homes one was really shocking when you look at stats of the price increases. Duopolies, payment systems, beer, phone operating systems, online advertising, kidney dialysis, glasses. Like, this is everything in our economy.
I mean, even stuff like manufacturing in a way, like with the airline industry, the amount of regulation that you have to comply with, the amount of like paperwork that has to be filled out for you to make a piece of 90-degree steel rebar that goes into a 747. It's literally a piece of metal that goes on the inside of a plane, but it is so regulated that there's only like one or two companies that make it.
Yeah.
And so they're creating this, essentially non-functioning piece of like aeronautical equipment, but it's not. It's literally like a seatbelt.
There's an article that came out the other day that showed that Boeing was overcharging 4,760% on soap dispensers for their planes because they can.
Exactly. So it's like this ridiculous thing where these companies. I mean, hey, if you can charge whatever you want, they're going to charge whatever they want. But it's just this whole like, essentially what it's coming into is this amount of red tape, like literally facilitates the creation of these monopolies.
Yeah, and we'll get into that in two chapters from here, chapter 8. Oligopolies that control most of an industry, credit reporting bureaus, tax preparation, airlines, phone companies, banks, health insurance, and it has these really cool graphs that show the consolidation over time. It kind of looks like almost like a family tree kind of thing if you're watching the video. But like Sean was talking earlier about Warren Buffett investing in the airlines, and you can see over time how all these different airlines turn into like 4 airlines.
Yes.
It's pretty crazy. Health insurance, medical care, pharmacy benefit managers, drug wholesalers, meat and poultry, agriculture, media, title insurance. It's like every single part of the economy has turned into an oligopoly, duopoly, or monopoly, which is why the average person feels as though they're getting screwed because prices are increasing, but wages are not because of that.
Yes. And it's kind of this like, it's not, and then you pair that with like the organic inflation of having, a monetary system like we do. It's a recipe for destruction of the middle class and like an independent labor force.
Yeah.
Right.
Speaking of destruction of the middle class, this next chapter, chapter 7, what trusts and Nazis had in common. When I saw this chapter, I was like,
okay,
kind of, yeah. I was like, okay. But then you get into it, and it's pretty crazy when they kind of walk through the history of Nazi Germany, and then the middle class,
Volkswagen, all these companies.
There's a specific part that talks about the middle class. Here's a quote. Consequently, the Nazi regime favored the process of monopolistic concentration, reinforcing the power of industrial magnates and weakening the position of the middle and working classes. The Nazis wanted almost all industries to become cartels. In 1936, they passed a cartel law to force industries to form cartels where none existed. The consolidation of cartels under the Nazis was part of the general policy of reducing the number of private business entities with which the government must deal. So it makes it easier for the government to gain control over these oligopolies and cartels.
And that's kind of something a lot of people don't understand about like fascism in general. Like fascism is kind of it's like communism, but it favors, it's like state direction of private corporations and high concentration of private corporations. So favoring the monopoly, oligopoly, stuff like that. Whereas communism is direct state control of industry. Yeah. So it's like one company that is controlled by the state. Whereas in fascism, it's the state is providing direction. It's not actually controlling it, but it's facilitating kind of private ownership of everything.
Yeah. Yeah, you can think of fascism as socialism with more of like a national direction.
Yeah, in a way, yeah, but private, like privatized communism.
Yep. This, as it walks through the history of Nazi Germany, it got to something super interesting that I've never heard of before, where it talks about the U.S. Army going through Germany and writing these reports. So I'll read a little bit. This is a longer section, but I think it's really valuable to hear. So this is pulled from a report from 1946 from the U.S. Army. They wrote on the progress of the German economy and post-war reconstruction after the war trials. The decartelization branch is making every effort to decentralize and decartelize all excessive concentrations of economic power in Germany. In carrying out this program, it will strive to convince the German people that economic democracy is a necessary basis for political democracy. In some aspects, the reorganization of the German economy along democratic lines is more important than mere mechanical decentralization. The German people must be taught that a democratic economy is most favorable medium for the full development of an individual, and that in such a medium, the material success of the individual will depend primarily on his own ability to satisfy the economic requirements of others. It is in such a system that an individual will exercise an alert and effective control over his government and will compel its officials to act for the general welfare rather than in the interest of some special class. Just as we must convince the Germans on the political side of the unsoundness of making an irrevocable grant of power to a dictator or an official authoritarian group, we must also convince them on the economic side of the unsoundness of allowing a private enterprise to acquire dictatorial power over any part of the economy. The branch will draw heavily on the experience acquired in the development of economic democracy in the United States and will endeavor to convince the German people that the development of free markets, the prevention of discrimination among businessmen and industrialists, the elimination of economic toll bridges, and the protection of the consumer are cornerstones to the reconstruction of a new democratic Germany. And then after that, it says the U.S. military, rebuilding Europe, and ordoliberal intellectuals agreed on one thing. Economic freedom goes hand in hand with political freedom, and it is the government's role to avoid concentrations of economic power.
Yeah. So, that kind of echoes another quote from, or another idea from Tragedy and Hope, which is another great book. But Quigley talks about how when deadly force is monopolized, political force is also monopolized, right? So in the Middle Ages, when we had monarchies and like kings and all that, what was the most effective weapon? It was the armored knight who, his weapons, his armor, all the things that were required to sustain him required tons of resources and were not affordable by the vast majority of people. Enter the firearm, which is mass produced and creates large, huge armies, huge standing armies. Well, now we have democracy because anybody can be the deadliest, force on the battlefield or anywhere, So like if the ability to essentially deal death is concentrated in the hands of the few, well, you're going to have an autocratic, more top-down system. If the ability to use lethal force is democratized, you're kind of taking that power away from the state and it's spreading it out to everyone, and therefore you have a more free and open economy. Or a free, open society.
So that tie between technology and economic system and political system is really interesting. And that was one of the main insights I pulled from this Army report from 1946, which I thought was really cool and why I wanted to read it. And then, as Sean just brought up, you have that this kind of canalization of that three system tie with the kings controlling the expensive knights' weapons, and then it's democratized as you have guns and small firearms that everyone can have, and then it canalizes again once you get to
the fighter jet, and the tank,
the fire jet, the tank, rockets. But now it's getting democratized again as you get small drones that are affordable and stuff like that. So it's kind of this contraction and expansion that flows with technology. That's just really cool.
Yeah, it is. That's just the evolution of society, political society, economic society, stuff like that. Concentration results in repressive governments. I think that's kind of what we can draw from both this Army report and then the idea drawn from Tragedy and Hope. The more concentrated anything is, the more likely it is to become autocratic.
Yeah, and another thing from the end of that quote that I was reading, I'm not sure if the listeners heard me say ordoliberal intellectuals. I did not know what ordoliberalism was. I'm not sure if you did, Sean.
Not really, no.
So I did not know, but it says it in the book. It explains it, as the book does with all these terms that the average person might not know. So ordoliberalism is liberalism with a strong government that creates rules and frameworks for business and economy to function properly. And when you get into Austrian economics, a lot of people that follow Austrian economics believe in a more laissez-faire system of government. But Friedrich Hayek, who's one of the foundational economists for Austrian economics, it says here that he was a believer in free markets and railed against concentrations of power. He believed that inevitably, once economic power was consolidated, the monopolies and cartels would become governmental instrumentalities to achieve political ends. So for people that are reading this book that are more to the right, more laissez-faire, I think they'll be really surprised when they read this book, because it will make you think, oh, maybe not all government in the economy is bad. Maybe we do need government to provide these guide rails and have these antitrust enforcements. That was one of the big things that I pulled from this book, because as someone who is more libertarian, laissez-faire, it made me recognize, okay, this antitrust enforcement is actually really important, and the government does have a pretty big role to play in protecting the people from the businesses.
But it's the same thing as institutional capture. It's just like we've talked about with the FDA. If all your funding is coming from the industry you're supposed to regulate, well, you're probably not going to regulate them very well.
Yeah, right? Or like that quote we read from the last chapter, where the people that the government agencies that were supposed to be regulating it were just watching porn during work hours. During the great financial
crisis.
Global recession.
Exactly. But yeah, so going off of that and moving on to chapter 8, we have regulation and chemotherapy. So Ted, if you want to pull up that quote on page 170 regarding drug prices.
Yeah. So this chapter gets into specific drugs and how the prices increased. And this chapter goes a lot into patents and how patent. You're going to pee?
Yeah.
Okay. We'll take a quick break. Pee break. And we're back. Real quick, it's hilarious that Sean was the one that had to call for the pee break, because that is now 2 days in a row where Sean has had to call for a pee break. And he usually makes fun of me because right before we start every podcast, I always go and pee real quick. Even if I had just peed like 15 minutes before, he always makes fun of me like, dude, why do you have to pee so much? And I always say, no, I'm peeing right before we start so I don't have to pee in the middle.
Yeah. But I've recently stepped up my hydration game, so I'm now a slave to the whims of my pee needs, I guess.
Yesterday we were headed to a range about an hour and a half away.
2 hours.
2 hours all in a van, some Army guys, and Sean breaks like 75% of the way there. He's like, guys, pull over. I need to jump in the woods and pee.
You came with me.
I was like, yes, Sean broke. And then he broke again today. So hilarious. And he can never make fun of me again for peeing right before an episode.
I can. It's it's an 80-20 rule. Ted's got 80%.
Well, I mean, our potential future guest, Joe Rogan, does pee breaks.
He does pee breaks. So. Joe Rogan, big pee break guy. Pee break enjoyer.
Okay. So what are we on? Chapter 8 now?
Yes.
Yeah. So it goes through patents and how patents have kind of affected different upstarts and protected these larger companies and allowed them to increase prices. It goes into pharma for the first few examples. So reading from this one, if caught early and treated, Wilson's disease is not a problem. For years, the answer was pills of cyprine or cupramine. These cost around $1 a pill in most countries. These pills were always affordable for a good reason. They were not expensive to produce. Merck, which had originally owned cupramine and cyprine, had kept the prices low. But in 2006, they sold the drugs to a small company called Atone, which began raising the prices. Then in 2010, Atone sold the drugs to Valiant Pharmaceuticals. This is when prices soared. Valiant raised the list price to around $300,000 for a year's supply in the United States, or $25,000 a month. Take in mind, it used to be $1 a pill. There was no generic version of either drug due to a backlog of drug approvals at the FDA. Most patients cannot afford the drugs, and they will die like Jeff Durlam if they do not get the drugs. And it goes into many different pharmaceuticals here and gets into how
Valiant was one of the biggest companies that did this. It's like their MO is literally buying the rights to produce a drug in which there is no generic form, and then just bump that price up to whatever they can get.
Yeah, the next example is Valiant doing that and increasing the price 2,700%.
It's unbelievable.
So this chapter gets into how the different regulatory agencies, especially the FDA, create this system where companies can't produce generic forms of these drugs, and also how patents allow different companies to just increase and skyrocket prices. I've got a couple good quotes here from the author. One thing that can make a monopoly permanent is government, because only government can prevent the sort of innovation and competition that undermines every corporate giant. And then Friedrich Hayek, again, he said, private monopoly is scarcely ever complete and even more rarely of long duration or able to disregard potential competition. But a state monopoly is always a state-protected monopoly, protected against both potential competition and effective criticism. And so it gets into Google, Microsoft, a bunch of different companies. It has a graph here, which we'll include in the video, that shows patents issued annually, and it lines up with price increases. So very, very interesting chapter. I had not really been anti-patent before. If you go back to like episode 35 or 36 in our healthcare mega episode, Nick talked a lot about how he thinks that drug companies and pharmaceutical companies shouldn't be allowed to have patents, because right now I think they have patents that usually protect them for 10 years where no one else can produce that drug. And the argument is often made that they need those patents so that they can collect profits, so that they can then do research and create more drugs. But after reading this chapter, I'm definitely more inclined to agree with Nick, which I didn't.
And I think a position is probably a little bit more moderated, maybe like cut it to 5 years or something, right? Because the whatchamacallit, the profit margins on a lot of these drugs, right? You know, like the upfront cost going into the R&D, that's what actually costs the millions of dollars and stuff like that. The actual production.
And not only that, it's the trials that they have to do through the FDA will cost millions and millions of dollars.
So it's the government, and then obviously the long pipeline of research and stuff like that is causing this massive upfront cost, which they then have to try and recoup in the subsequent, after approval, where they can actually sell it, which causes the higher prices and necessitates the patent to exist. But if you simply just made the FDA not cost these companies so much to do these trials, like find a way to make the government portion a little more efficient, because that is tax dollars and stuff like that at play there, maybe we could cut down on the length of the patents, or even like the profit incentive could go down a little bit because it's a little more affordable to create these drugs. I think the
three-headed monster of RFK, Vivek, and Elon could potentially help us.
It might, yes. With that. Yeah, I would hope so.
Yeah. There's a really good quote about regulation in this chapter as well, from the author. This brings us to the very ugly truth about regulation. While big business often complain about regulation, the truth is that even though it is painful and annoying, they don't mind it and even favor it. Regulations that are burdensome enough to kill small companies, but are not strong enough to kill large ones, are in fact ideal.
Yeah. And that goes back to kind of a general theme of this book is that oftentimes the government regulations are actually facilitating the creation of these oligopolies and monopolies. So like the more red tape there is, the more difficult it is for disruptors to break into that sector of the economy and actually force competition, because they're being frozen out by high, input costs or just, the pure amount of bewildering regulations that you'd have to have a team of lawyers to make sure you're in compliance with, rather than just getting out there and, undercutting the giants.
Yeah, and then the end of the chapter gets even more into government regulation and talks about government-granted barriers to entry. There's a hilarious quote in here from Glenn Reynolds, CEO of credit research firm Credit Sites. He said, "It's easier to raise a militia with armed assault rifles in Michigan than it is to become an NRSO, or NRSRO, Nationally Recognized Statistical Rating Organization," which is like Moody's. So that's hilarious. But yeah, if the government grants you a barrier to entry and just turns you into a duopoly or monopoly that no one can create a company to compete against, that's the golden ticket right there.
Exactly.
All right. Very interesting chapter. I loved reading it. I burned through this book. It was such a great read. It's surprising. It's very informative. It'll make you change your mind on, I would say, multiple economic policies.
It'll also give you inspiration.
Yeah.
And be like, oh, wow, if I could just get the paperwork done in this, then I could be also making a lot of money. So it's an interesting book that kind of gives you a more realistic look at what's going on and how these economic giants actually function.
It also might give you insight on what stocks to buy. So turning to this page at the end of the chapter, page 189, if you want to get the book and immediately flip to this page. This is where Sean was saying it looks like a schizophrenic was marking up this book. This page is certainly one of those. So lobbying's astronomical returns are reflected in the stock market. Over 10 years ago, the consulting firm Strategas created an index to see whether lobbying would provide superior stock market returns. They found that investing in a portfolio of companies that spend the most on lobbying and influencing regulators would consistently beat the market. Shocker. Companies that lobby can distort the rules of the game in their favor. Currying favor with legislators and regulators pays off spectacularly. Over the past 10 years, the Strategas lobbying portfolio beat the Standard & Poor's 500 by 5 percentage points every year. Wow. I immediately, upon reading this page, went out and bought 5 shares.
That's a good idea.
I don't think we're allowed to recommend stocks that people buy, but
but it is an interesting. It's something to think about. Food for thought. And it's kind of like the Nancy Pelosi portfolio tracker.
Yeah. This it just looks like a hack. It has a chart in here from 2009 to 2018 tracking the returns. The S&P 500 total return over that period of time was 308%. Mm-hmm. We always talk about low-cost index funds and how they track the market, and it goes up over time. Over the course of 10 years there, 308% for the S&P 500 is incredible if you can get that with those low-cost index funds. But then the Strategas lobbying portfolio total return was 472.93%.
What's its ticker? Does it have one?
I found it pretty easily. I think I just Googled Strategas lobbying portfolio total return or Strategas lobbying in portfolio index, and I found it, and then I bought it. So it's, what's the ticker on it? You can Google it and find the ticker. Yeah. We'll post it in the video. I'm not sure if we're allowed to do that, but anyways, you can find it.
Yeah, it's out there. We'll put it somewhere maybe.
I don't know the rules on us like promoting stocks because it could be looked at as like a pump and dump situation. But we just gave you guys the stats on the S&P.
Yeah. We don't want to be getting in trouble. More government regulation suffocating innovation here. So it's call your local congressman. Legalize pump and dumps. No, I'm kidding.
One more thing that I find interesting. It wasn't in this book, but when we're talking about pharma there and like the patents and that kind of stuff, a lot of people on the right aren't the biggest fans of Dan Crenshaw, although he is a Republican congressman. But he was trying to get a bill passed that he wrote where he was trying.
Did he write it?
He was essentially trying to make it so that people with like terminal diagnoses could get experimental treatments much easier, so that.
I mean, it's your cancer. You should be able to
so
experiment on it.
Just because this treatment didn't go through the FDA, well, if there isn't a treatment to help you for your
terminal diagnosis.
Pancreatic cancer, well, maybe you can go get this experimental treatment. They don't know the side effects of it. It might kill you. But if you want to take that risk because you already have this diagnosis that you have 2 months to live, you should have the right to be able to go into a contract with a business and try that treatment. Because there's a lot of different legal parameters around that where you have to get approval through the FDA first. And there's some way that you can go through like experimental treatments and signing up for studies, but he was trying to make it easier for that.
To be a general thing that people do, which I agree. It's 100% a great piece of legislation that should be. So
that's another potential solution to some of those pharma FDA issues that we were talking about. All right, Chapter 9, Sean, Organizing America.
Good old JP. So page 199, we have a quote regarding stocks. So almost half of Americans do not own any stocks. According to Gallup, only 54% of Americans own stocks either in brokerage accounts or through retirement savings plans. This is a decline from 62% prior to the 2008 financial crisis, and less than 14% of households directly own corporate stock. Despite record gains in the S&P in 2017, nearly half of Americans did not share in these historic profits. The wealthiest 1% own nearly 50% of stock, and the top 10% own more than 81%. In contrast, the middle class owns only 8% of all stocks.
So this chapter gets a lot into how with this concentration of the economy, wages are not going up for the middle class. And the middle class isn't owning these stock portfolios.
Which are the primary means through which wealth is built.
So although wealth is being created and the stock market is going up, the average American isn't seeing the benefits of that because the way that the economy is growing and the results that you're seeing in this increase in wealth is in the stock market. But the middle class, the working class, doesn't own these stocks. It's the wealthy, and that's contributing to this wealth disparity in America.
Exactly. And what at the end they say, ultimately inequality is both a result of and is driven by stock ownership. So if you're out there and you don't have a brokerage, you don't have an IRA, you don't have a 401k, like that's you need to get in there and get that going. Because
the train is leaving. Get on.
Yes, I mean, and it will continue to go. Until I don't know. I remember when coronavirus hit, and obviously market just tanks, right? And I had a couple $1,000, and I was like, okay, well, two things, right? Either the market recovers completely and continues to go up, and I have a massive, there's a fire sale essentially right now, or it's the end of the world and my dollars mean nothing. And so I just put it all in because I was like,
I put all of my savings. I put like $3,000 at that time because I had just gotten out of college. I didn't have a ton of money.
Same here.
I put like all of my money that I'd made personal training that was in my savings into the stock market on like March 22nd or March 23rd because the stock market was dropping so fast, and it wound up being like the low point of Corona was like this day that I put all of my money into stocks, and I got like a 3x return over the course of the next 4 years. I mean, my portfolio still just shows these incredible returns, and it's not because I'm picking the best stocks. It's just index funds and ETFs. It's just I got the S&P 500 March 23rd when it was the lowest that it dropped to.
So it's kind of a we're not recommending like any type of like trading strategy or a specific stock, but just like if you're not investing in the stock market in some shape or form, you're making a severe mistake because inflation is outpacing your savings. And the most efficient means to, build wealth with compound interest and protect your savings is actually the stock market. Particularly if you are a younger individual and you don't plan to access that money within a decade. Right.
Yeah. And this chapter continues to get more into the stock market and how like Warren Buffett has invested in Berkshire Hathaway. And then it gets into how the stock market is increasing in value because of the consolidation of these companies. Here it says, investors make money when the industry, not individual companies, make money. The easiest way to do this is to raise consumer prices. Instead of stealing market share from one another by aggressively competing on price or quality, companies can simply raise prices on consumers and increase their profit margins. This isn't just theory. Studies are now showing that increased common ownership correlates to higher consumer prices. So it goes on to show how Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street are contributing to this consolidation, the horizontal shareholding, as it calls it, and it gets into that. But yeah, definitely a extremely interesting chapter to read.
And that's back to the Buffett thing. It's like Buffett didn't invest. Like there's no airline equivalent of the S&P 500, right? But what he did do is he bought a significant stake in each individual airline that is remaining.
You can also buy a Jets ETF that holds all those airlines. Yeah,
interesting.
That's what I did during Corona.
Yeah, smart.
So it also goes further into BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. Passive funds now own 40% of all U.S. assets and would own 100% by 2030 if the immense growth trajectory continues. The amount that these companies own of the S&P 500 is insane. 2018, collectively, those three passive funds owned 18.4% of the S&P 500. Jeez. Like they just buy up massive shares in all these companies and just grow larger and larger over time. Yeah, it's quite insane. I think we can move on to the next chapter.
100%. So chapter 10, the missing piece of the puzzle. Page 216. Let's get that graph up.
All right. So we'll put both of these graphs side by side in the video if you're watching. But on page 216, it has a graph that shows the fiscal income share of the top 1%. So how much of the country's income is coming from the top 1%. Right before the Great Depression, it was up at 28-ish%. And then it dropped down. You have the golden years of prosperity where that share of the top 1% is the lowest. And obviously that means there's more money in the middle class. And then I wrote in boomer control as it increases from 1980 on. And it's just this U shape from the Great Depression until now. And then almost the same exact chart is showed with antitrust enforcement later on in the chapter. It's high in the early 1900s with low antitrust enforcement. And then the golden age of prosperity, it drops down, high antitrust enforcement, and then it increases again with horizontal shareholding. So pretty interesting graphs that mimic each other in a way.
Yeah. And I mean, that kind of shows what, I mean, many people are going to be, talking about how, they always show like the side by sides of like, oh, like this happened and therefore we should be afraid of this. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be going into another Great Depression, but the pieces are certainly being aligned. Yeah. For something, so some type of bottom falling out type situation. And I've read a couple articles on like different theories about why this stuff is going on, and like you look at the home ownership market right now, like there are a lot of parallels with previous financial crises and where we currently are right now. So
always a good idea to have cash on hand to invest if the stock market
but that
drops,
doesn't mean you need to time the market. You should be regularly getting in there and investing on a regular basis so you cost average effectively. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't also be saving, because let's say you're saving up for I don't know, a boat or something, and then the market tanks 30% in one day. You could just throw that money into the market, right? So we're not saying to try and time the market, because that 99% of the time it never works, except unless you're Ted Rohr. But it is something that it is a good idea to have cash on hand, even if it's only a little bit, just so that you can, punch the market when it's down.
punch it when it's down.
Yeah, punch the market when it's down. That's the message of the day.
So the missing piece of the puzzle here, this last chapter, also gets into like the conclusions that people have drawn with this wealth disparity. It specifically mentions a book by Thomas Piketty. It's called Capital in the 21st Century. And so this book went through a bunch of data on the wealth disparity and income disparity. And one of the conclusions of it was that we need to tax the top 1% with an 80% tax rate, and how that would decrease the income disparity. But then when economists went through this book, they found that a lot of the data was fraudulent and none of the calculations could be replicated. So that's always funny when that happens. But that reminded me a lot of like Bernie's claims, the millionaires and the billionaires, or once he became a millionaire, the billionaires and the trillionaires. Hilarious to see the language switch there. But it goes into how the solution is not necessarily to just tax the crap out of the top 1%. It's to reduce this consolidation of companies in the economy, and to reinvigorate antitrust enforcement.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the more important parts. Is we looked at that graph of wealth concentration, and then antitrust enforcement, and I think the lesson to be gleaned from that is that when government does do its job and stays within its lane, things are generally pretty good. When the captain is not at the helm, or there is an overreach, that's when things get bad. So the economy is really all about balance. And people behaving appropriately within the role that they currently hold.
Yeah. The last thing I wanted to hit in this chapter is the Gini coefficient, which I had not heard of before, but it's essentially the CEO to worker pay ratio. And it goes through the statistics in the US and a bunch of other developed countries. And it's pretty crazy. The change in CEO to worker pay ratio was 33 to 1 in 1978 and grew to 303 to 1 in 2014. And it shows how big of an outlier the US is in this area. I don't know exactly how you change that, because for one, if someone's an extremely successful CEO, like
they should be compensated.
Yeah, we just saw the guy that moved from Chipotle to Starbucks after he increased the valuation of Chipotle and did a great job. Starbucks brought him in and paid him an exorbitant amount. But like, companies can do that if they want to get someone that's going to turn their company around. Yeah. It reminds me of the NFL. These head coaches make so much money than all the other coaches, especially the guys at the top. But they get paid that much because they're the guys that are winning Super Bowls, or have won Super Bowls in the past and had a lot of success in the past. So if you're really successful in your career field, you're going to be compensated more. Yeah. So
and a lot of these compensation packages, particularly for CEOs, are stock options. Yeah. So it's like, well, how do you make that difference. You're not going to give the guy who's running the checkout at Kohl's stock options, right? Like that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
I mean, you could. I know that Tesla does that actually, which is pretty interesting. And that's, one of the criticisms of Mr. Musk from the left and from the unions is that to prevent unionization of his labor force, he offers his workers ownership opportunities and like stock options. Like even if you're just like a welder, you get that, which I think is pretty cool. But like in a certain industry, like where it's unskilled labor, that's not really an option.
Yeah. That's the end of it, but it goes into a conclusion. Should we read through just some of his points? I would say the broad strokes, like the bullets, essentially. All right, so I'll hit one quote and then I'll just read just the one-liners. So you want to read this quote? There is one quote that I do want to go to, okay, but we'll hit it at the end. We can go through. Yeah, it's this one. But let's go through principles for reform really quick. This is essentially what the author is advocating for, and like things like general rules of thumb, right? So capitalism without competition is not capitalism. The essential role of capitalism is not maximizing efficiency, contrary to popular belief. Monopolies, not big business, are the enemy of competition. So that's there's a difference between a monopoly and a large corporation. Yep. Competition is a critical element of capitalism because it promotes the diffusion of economic power and political freedom. Markets must remain competitive and open to new entrants. Capitalism must be in favor of equal opportunity, but not equal outcomes. Capitalism does not exist independently of government and society. Reinforcing that idea that government has a role to play in ensuring a free market. Solutions and remedies. Mergers should be materially reduced. That materially reduce the number of competitors should be prevented. So essentially just enforcing the laws already on the books. The standard for rejecting mergers must be based on simple, clear rules. Previous mergers that have reduced competition should be reversed. Antitrust is not a field that can be handed over exclusively to economists. Anti-monopoly is more than antitrust. Vertical integration should face significant hurdles. Local monopolies should be broken up. Industries should not be exempt from antitrust supervision. Antitrust authorities should face greater transparency. New laws should be instituted to punish predatory pricing by firms in highly concentrated industries. Antitrust trials should be speeded up rapidly. And then under regulations must serve society, not erect barriers to entry for monopolists. Regulation should be based on principles, not complex rules. Regulatory capture and the revolving door are evils that must be avoided at all costs. Create common carriage rules for internet platforms that sell third-party services. Create rules that reduce switching costs and customer lock-in. To promote competition, patents and copyrights must only be granted for a limited time without extension. Competition must be encouraged. Once patents expire, Congress should remove patent protection for areas that are rife with abuse. And finally, under shareholders, workers must be granted shares so that labor can become owners of capital, which is interesting. We're going to go into this in a little bit. This kind of brings us all the way back around to Chesterton, right? Yeah. Horizontal shareholding should be disallowed. That means, kind of doing what individuals like Warren Buffett do, where they buy, 10% of Vanguard,
each major company.
BlackRock, State Street, get rid of
so
those,
they're essentially like majority shareholders across an industry. They might not own all of it, but they're enough that they have a seat at the table. Share buybacks should be severely limited, and managers should be forced to own shares they purchase via stock options for at least a year. So that prevents any type of like just dumping of shares to enrich themselves. So the quote that I wanted to focus on, right? Because this whole book is talking about how the current system, the history of the economy in the United States. I had a great discussion with a couple friends last night about how, in more of a political scheme, like how did we get to where we are now, right? At what point do we realize that the system that was instituted like we're at the bottom of the slide, right? And this quote, what bothers me about it is it says, if we are to reform capitalism and avoid the concentration of economic power, we must return to the roots of capitalism and antitrust. We must restore competition where it is missing. We must safeguard markets for new entrants, and we must end regulatory capture that corrupts politics. The problem with this is that it's not recognizing that the position we're in right now, just like the political scenario where we are right now, it's the end result of the system, right? Like I said, is like we started at the top, right? You know, maybe when the founding fathers or like free market capitalism became a thing, we were at the top of the slide and we're going down and it's a twisty slide and there's bumps and stuff. And, you know, that's unionization and all sorts of, you know, different innovations that occurred in the economy. But where we are right now is the kind of end result, right? We're at the bottom of the slide. And so if we simply just go back, if we just move the clock backwards 100 years, what is going to stop it from 200 years from now? We're back in the same spot, right? Mm-hmm. Like how that's why like that, you know, the conservative rhetoric of like, we must return to this, like it's not changing anything. You're just simply, you're scooching your ass back up the slide and gravity's going to pull you right back down because the system that you're operating within, this is the result of it, right?
I see what you're saying, because it's just going to be this loop where if we are able to reset it eventually, it will get to this place where the cartels and oligopolies come back because antitrust will stop being enforced. But I think what it comes down to there is it's nearly impossible to develop a framework that will continue to exist 100, 200 years in the future. This is why the Constitution is such an incredible document, because the Founding Fathers did such a great job trying to create that framework. And yes, over time, it will be stretched and torn and manipulated where it's not, the system isn't fulfilling the original intent because it's not playing by the rules. But I don't think you can create a perfect system. So what you have to do is realize, okay, this is the best system we've got. It's up to each generation to try and uphold that and maintain the rules that are put in place for a reason. But if a generation fails to do that, well, over time, it will get bad enough where
the degeneration will continue and compound, just like compound interest, you know, like the degeneration of, you know, the economy and society and stuff like that compounds over time, right?
Yeah.
The more corrupt your society is, the more corrupt your economy will be.
Yeah.
And I think that I just wanted to kind of tie this all in together, right? Because is this a critique of liberalism and capitalism, right? Is this, I mean, not really. He's saying we need to like rewind the clock. But I guess what I'm saying is my primary issue with an idea like that is that it is so dependent on individuals, you know, actually adhering to the rules and, you know, the weight and momentum of history, simply not just repeating those same mistakes. And like, what are those mistakes that brought us to where we are, where there's, you know, these cartels actually controlling the economy and stuff like that? And how do we prevent that? And I think I would like to talk about this distributism.
Get into Chesterton.
Yeah. So it was kind of started in, where did it say? It was like 1890s. Pope Leo XIII wrote Rerum Novarum, which was essentially like an economic encyclical. And Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, and Dorothy Day, a bunch of Catholic thinkers were big proponents of this. So essentially what it is, it's kind of this odd middle ground between capitalism and socialism. It disowns both. It says that it views capitalism and socialism as inherently flawed and exploitative due to the concentration of the assets, whether it's in private hands or government hands. So it says neither is good. It says that private property is a top priority. Productive assets should be widely owned rather than concentrated. It favors small businesses and craftsmen and mutual organizations and cooperatives, right? Vigorous antitrust laws on the books. So, and that's kind of like
so you reading that is exactly what this book argues for.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, in some ways, so that one quote that I was talking about kind of doesn't really jive with his recommendations. I guess that's what I'm kind of trying to say to Mr. Tepper is what he is advocating for in that quote, turn back the clock, like go back to capitalism. He's not really advocating for that. What he's advocating for is this hybrid economic theory known as distributism.
Well, I think he is, because he says that, like, let's turn back the clock, but then he also provides the other recommendations that you read off in the conclusion, which those recommendations paired with turning back the clock to free market, getting rid of the concentration, enforcing antitrust laws, that gets you to this distributism with against concentration in the hands of private individuals and the state. That's what this book goes through. Views capitalism and socialism as flawed and exploitative due to concentration. That's what this book says. Favors small businesses and craftsmen and mutual organizations and cooperatives. Yeah. I think this book argues for that as well. Vigorous antitrust laws. Yes. This book definitely advocates for that. So I think this book, I guess, just falls in that bucket.
It does, but I think that's kind of what I was trying to like articulate, was that the author, maybe not knowing it himself, is actually advocating for distributism and not turning back the clock. Yeah. Right? Because he's just saying that because that's like accepted rhetoric, right? But nobody knows about this. This is actually an economic system that's been fairly, researched and like advocated for and written about. But nobody's really tried it. Yeah. And this is essentially what he's advocating for, but he thinks of it as early stage capitalism, whereas in reality it's distributism. Yeah. And so essentially Pope Leo XIII was like, I'm paraphrasing some quotes here, but he says, the misery and wretchedness pressing so unjustly on the majority of the working class is a result of a small number of rich men have been able to lay upon the teeming masses of the laboring poor a yoke little better than that of slavery itself. And so essentially he goes on to affirm the right of all men to own property, the necessity of a system that allowed as many as possible to become owners, and the duty of employers to provide safe working conditions and sufficient wages. Common ownership and government ownership are not advocated for, as they just result in the same issues, right? So Chesterton, when writing on this, he says that property is merely the art of the democracy. It means that every man should have something that he can shape in his own image, as he is shaped in the image of heaven. But because he is not God, but only a graven image of God, his self-expression must deal with limits, properly with limits that are strict and even small. Belloc, his take on it, I kind of agree with a little more, where he says the distributive state, meaning a government that institutes distributism, says that there is an agglomeration of families of varying wealth, but by far the greater number of owners of the means of production, right? So that's kind of like what we were talking about, where, the labor actually has common ownership, like how we talked about with Musk and Tesla. Like he's incentivizing people to work hard, because if they're turning out quality products, the share price rises. So even if you're not an executive at the company, you're benefiting from your company doing better. Yeah. And finally, I find this really interesting, and this is an alternative to government regulation, is they advocate for the return of the guild system to regulate industry rather than the government. So what that is professional associations. And those professional associations, they do the accreditation, they do all that stuff rather than the government, right? So like if you want to be, a shoemaker or an engineer, you belong to the guild, and they police each other, right? So you have to have that guild accreditation rather than a government accreditation, right? So it's a private professional organization of people who are all really good at this job, and they all know the industry, and it's not just some random regulator that can be bought. Yeah. Because the members of the guild, they can't really be bought because they all own their own companies. So why would they why would they be bribed?
Yeah, the members of the Lollipop Guild own all the lollipops and the chocolate.
Exactly.
All right. Final thoughts on this book. Let's get your rating and quick.
I would say a 7. It's a good shock to the brain. Kind of causes you to think about things that you generally wouldn't. It gives you insights into a lot of more complicated aspects of the American economy and kind of understanding as to how we got into the position that we are in and why things function the way they do. That's what I always like, trying to understand the why rather than the is. Mm-hmm. You know, that's more important to me, is to understand the root causes of the symptoms rather than just being mad about the symptoms of something. Yeah. And I think that's something that a lot of people struggle to get to. And this book is really effective at saying, yes, these are the symptoms, but here is why they're occurring.
Yeah. I would give it a 9.5. Mm-hmm. It was a page turner for me, which is, I think, very hard to do with an economic book. Mm-hmm. But I ripped through it. I couldn't stop reading it. I learned a ton from it. It made me change my mind on some things. So to me, those, like the entertainment value, learning, forcing me to change my mind, those make it way up there on the 9 or the 10 side of the scale. That's what I always look for in like an amazing book. That's not a fiction book, I guess. So I would give it a 9.5, and I've recommended it to a lot of friends already. Mm-hmm. And if you haven't read Myth of Capitalism, I'd recommend getting a copy.
100%. I would recommend reading it. I talked to my dad about it. You know, like it's I only talk to him about good books, so I'm not going to recommend him something crappy. So it's definitely worth the read. And if you have Spotify Premium or something like that, like I said, it's for free. You're already paying for it. You might as well listen to it.
Yeah, and we'll send an email to Jonathan Tepper and ask him if he knows about Distributism.
Yes, and we'll let you know what he says.
All right. Thanks for sticking with us through the pee break and all. We will be back in the future next week with another episode. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for joining us today at Weights and Wealth, and don't forget to apply today's lessons to live healthy and wealthy.
If this conversation will contribute to your fitness and financial gains, please share it with a friend or family member and give a 5-star review so more people can lift bigger weights and get bigger bank accounts.